Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the murky depths of Louisiana's Bayou country, where the Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds from ancient cypress trees, there once stood a plantation house that locals would cross themselves before passing. Even now, the remaining foundation stones are avoided by those who know the history of Willow Creek Plantation and its mistress, Eleanor Blackwood. The year was 1851 when the first disappearance was noted in the parish records. But the horror had begun long before that. The Blackwood plantation stood 3 miles east of Franklin, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during the rainy season. The grand house, built in 1815 by Thomas Blackwood, was considered an architectural marvel of its time. 3 stories of imposing white columns and wraparound verandas that seemed to float above the surrounding swampland. By 1851, the house had fallen into a state of elegant decay, much like its widowed owner. Society columns from the Franklin Planter's Banner described her as a vision of refined Southern beauty, with an uncommon education in sciences unusual for ladies of quality. What those columns failed to mention was Eleanor's peculiar fascination with medical texts brought from Europe, or the curious laboratory equipment that arrived in crates marked as household goods. The daughter of a Charleston physician who had bucked convention by educating his only child in subjects typically reserved for men, Eleanor had developed an early interest in anatomy and preservation techniques. Eleanor Blackwood, formerly Eleanor Montgomery of Charleston, had arrived in Louisiana as a young bride in 1833. Her father's correspondence, discovered decades later in a Charleston historical collection, revealed his growing concern about his daughter's specific interests. Eleanor shows remarkable aptitude, he wrote to a colleague in 1830, but her questions about the persistence of life after apparent death disturb me greatly. She speaks of death not as an ending, but as a transition that might be interrupted or even reversed through proper scientific application. According to parish records, Thomas Blackwood died in 1845 of what was described as a wasting illness of unknown origin. The doctor's notes, discovered decades later during a courthouse renovation in 1963, indicated symptoms consistent with slow poisoning, though no accusation was ever made. Eleanor inherited the plantation, its considerable debt, and complete authority over the household and servants. The attending physician, Dr. James Wilson, noted in his private journal that Thomas's symptoms were most unusual, resembling no natural disease I have encountered in 30 years of practice. He described a progressive paralysis that began in the extremities and moved inward, while the patient's mental faculties remained disturbingly intact until the very end. Mr. Blackwood expressed to me privately, Dr. Wilson wrote, that he believed his condition was not natural, but when pressed, refused to elaborate, saying only that some knowledge should remain buried. The plantation overseer Jeremiah Dawson left abruptly 3 months after Thomas's death. His resignation letter, preserved in the Louisiana State Historical Society archives, stated only that he could not, in good conscience, remain in a household where Christian principles have been abandoned. He took a position at a plantation 40 miles away, and reportedly never spoke of his time with the widow Blackwood again. A letter discovered among Dawson's personal effects after his death in 1883 revealed more details about his hasty departure. Written to his brother but never sent, it described discovering Eleanor in her private study late one night, surrounded by anatomical diagrams and jars containing what appeared to be preserved human tissues. She did not see me at first, Dawson wrote, and I observed her making notes while examining something floating in a glass container, something that moved when she applied an electrical current to it. When she noticed me, she smiled in a way that chilled my blood and said, "Mr. Dawson, how fortunate. I've been considering how you might assist me in acquiring more robust specimens. I gave my notice the following morning. What happened at Willow Creek Plantation between 1845 and 1851 exists now only in fragments, servant testimonies, delivered in whispers to the parish priest, letters Eleanor wrote to scientific societies in Philadelphia and Boston, financial records showing unusual purchases of chemical compounds and medical equipment, and the journal of Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, who visited the plantation twice before refusing to return. It was a house of silence, they say, a house where sounds that should have been heard never were, and things that should have remained silent spoke in the dead of night. Following Thomas's death, Eleanor converted the east wing of the mansion into what she called her research area. Household accounts show substantial expenditures for laboratory equipment, chemicals, and specialized glass containers imported from Europe. The local pharmacist in Franklin, Augustus Wells, kept records of Eleanor's unusual orders, chemicals typically used only in medical schools for the preservation of cadavers, electrical components similar to those used in early experiments with galvanism, surgical instruments of exceptional quality. Mrs. Blackwood's intellectual interests are to be commended, Wells wrote in a letter to a colleague in New Orleans, though I confess some discomfort at the quantities of preservative solutions she requires. When I inquired as to their purpose, she spoke of extending viability and challenging conventional understanding of cellular cessation. Her enthusiasm was such that I did not press further, though I wonder what botanical specimens could possibly require such specialized preparations. The first documented disappearance was that of a house servant named Mary, described in Eleanor's household accounts as no longer in service as of March 18, 1851. No reason was given. When the sheriff inquired, prompted by concerns raised by Mary's cousin in town, Eleanor produced papers showing Mary had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi. The papers appeared in order, and the matter was considered closed. But Mary was never seen again. What the sheriff failed to notice, but Professor Harrington discovered during his research in 1959, was that the plantation listed in the sale document had burned down 2 years earlier and no longer existed. Similar discrepancies would later be found in all the transfer papers Eleanor produced for missing servants throughout 1851, each supposedly sold to properties that were abandoned, non-existent, or whose owners had no record of such purchases. By September of that year, 3 more servants had transferred ownership, each sale documented with impeccable paperwork. Each servant vanished completely from record thereafter. The remaining household staff grew silent, eyes downcast, when in town on errands. Local shopkeepers noted their reluctance to return to the plantation as dusk approached. Franklin society largely ignored these concerning patterns. Eleanor's withdrawal from social life after becoming a widow was attributed to grief rather than seen as potentially suspicious. The few who visited Willow Creek during this period reported that Eleanor had developed eccentric habits, but nothing that warranted intervention. She maintained her correspondence with scientific societies, expanded her library with medical texts from Europe, and occasionally hosted visiting researchers whose specialized interests aligned with her own. What truly transpired behind the white columns of Willow Creek became the subject of investigation only after a catastrophic fire consumed much of the main house in December of 1851. The ruins revealed spaces that appeared on no architectural plans, rooms beneath rooms, sealed chambers with strange metal tables, drainage systems unlike anything seen in domestic architecture of the period. And in the east wing cellar, preserved from the fire by thick stone walls, authorities discovered what one deputy described in his official report as evidence of practices so contrary to nature that they cannot be detailed in polite company. The report was subsequently sealed by judicial order and reportedly destroyed during the Union occupation of Franklin in 1863. But some documents survived, some whispers persisted, and when Professor James Harrington of Tulane University began researching his monograph on medical practices in antebellum Louisiana in 1958, he uncovered threads of a story so disturbing that his academic department requested he abandon the project. He did not. Instead, he spent the next 5 years piecing together the true horror of what the widow Blackwood had been seeking in her isolated Bayou laboratory. What follows is the account compiled from those scattered records: court testimonies, personal correspondence, parish documents, and fragments of Eleanor Blackwood's own scientific notes recovered from a metal box buried beneath the plantation's old greenhouse. This is the story of a woman's obsession, of servants who vanished, and of experiments that defied both law and nature in the pursuit of knowledge man was never meant to possess. The humid air of Louisiana holds many secrets. This is but one of them. Thomas Blackwood had been a respected figure in St. Mary Parish, a plantation owner of moderate wealth whose primary crop was sugarcane. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had a reputation for relative fairness within the brutal system of plantation life. Parish records indicate fewer incidents of extreme punishment than neighboring properties, and his medical ledger shows regular payment to physicians to treat ill servants rather than simply replacing them, an economic calculation as much as a humanitarian one. The union between Thomas and Eleanor was arranged through family connections, a common practice among the planter class. Thomas had lost his first wife to yellow fever in 1831 and sought a new bride from outside Louisiana, believing this might avoid a similar tragedy. Eleanor's family in Charleston saw advantage in connecting their daughter to established plantation wealth, particularly as her unconventional education and interests had made her a somewhat difficult prospect in Charleston society. A cousin who had attended Eleanor's wedding wrote in her diary, "The bride showed none of the typical nervousness of a young woman embarking on matrimony. Instead, she questioned the ship's captain at length about the journey to Louisiana, particularly regarding the preservation of specimens in the Gulf climate." Thomas appeared bemused by his bride's scientific preoccupations, likely considering them a harmless eccentricity that would fade once she assumed her responsibilities as mistress of Willow Creek. Eleanor Montgomery had come to the marriage with a substantial dowry and connections to wealthy Charleston families, but also with something less tangible, a restless intellect that found little satisfaction in the traditional occupations of a plantation mistress. Correspondence with her former tutor in Charleston, found in a collection of letters donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1942, reveals a young woman with an unusual education for her time. Miss Montgomery continues to show remarkable aptitude for scientific inquiry, wrote Professor William Hammond in 1830. Her questions regarding anatomical matters and chemical processes demonstrate a mind better suited to university study than domestic arrangements, though I have cautioned her that such interests are not considered appropriate for a young lady of her station. The same collection contained a disturbing note from Hammond to Eleanor's father, expressing concern about specific directions of her studies. "Your daughter's recent inquiries have taken a troubling turn. She has requested texts on galvanic experiments, particularly Aldini's work with executed criminals, and has asked pointed questions about the boundary between life and death that I find unsettling. While I admire her intellect, I wonder if some guidance toward more suitable feminine interests might be advisable." The marriage, by all accounts, was one of convenience rather than passion. Thomas gained social connections and financial relief. Eleanor obtained the freedom that came with distance from Charleston society and its restrictive expectations. For the first decade, the arrangement seemed to function adequately. Eleanor established herself as an efficient, if somewhat remote, mistress of the household. She maintained correspondence with scientific societies under her husband's name, acquiring publications and equipment that raised no suspicions when attributed to a gentleman planter with scholarly interests. According to household ledgers, in 1842, Eleanor converted a former storage building at the edge of the property into what she termed her still room, ostensibly for the preparation of medicines and household products common to plantation life. Unusually, this building was eventually fitted with a lock to which only Eleanor possessed the key. Even Thomas, according to his personal secretary's later testimony, was denied entry after a heated argument in the summer of 1844. The master came back to the house in a state of considerable agitation, recalled Richard Barnes in a statement given to the parish sheriff in January 1852. He told me that Mrs. Blackwood had finally gone too far and that he would be contacting his lawyer in the morning. He specifically mentioned something about unnatural preservation, though he would not elaborate further when I inquired. Barnes also noted that in the weeks leading up to this confrontation, unusual deliveries had arrived at Willow Creek, large quantities of ice from New Orleans, glass containers with specialized stoppers, and what appeared to be medical equipment. Most concerning was Thomas's mention of missing items from the servants' infirmary, though Barnes could not specify what had been taken. Thomas Blackwood fell ill the next day. His symptoms began with stomach distress and progressed to paralysis of the extremities over a period of 6 months. 3 physicians were consulted. None could determine the cause. The final physician, Dr. James Wilson from New Orleans, reportedly suggested poisoning as a possibility, but could not identify a specific agent. Thomas died in February 1845, leaving Eleanor in complete control of the plantation. The plantation's account books, reviewed after the fire, showed that Eleanor had made significant changes to the household operation following Thomas's death. The number of servants assigned to main house duties decreased dramatically. The still room was abandoned, and equipment was relocated to a newly renovated space in the East Wing basement. Expenditures for medical supplies and chemical compounds increased substantially, while agricultural investments declined. The servants' quarters at Willow Creek were situated approximately 200 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience, but far enough to preserve the illusion that the grand house existed in splendid isolation. The modest cabins housed approximately 40 individuals in 1845, responsible for both household management and agricultural labor. By 1851, that number had decreased to 27 according to tax records, a reduction Eleanor attributed to sales necessitated by financial constraints. What the records don't show, but what emerged in testimony after the fire, was the gradual process by which certain servants were relocated from the quarters to the main house basement. According to Sarah, a house servant who survived the events of 1851, this process followed a pattern. Eleanor would first select an individual for what she called special household duties. These servants would be moved into a room in the basement, supposedly a position of privilege, as it offered better accommodation than the external quarters. Miss Eleanor would choose them careful-like, Sarah testified to the parish sheriff. Always the strongest ones, the ones who didn't get sick, easy. She'd have them help her in that room with all the glass bottles and strange tools, saying she was teaching them valuable skills. They'd be proud at first, thinking they was being favored. Then they'd get quiet, real quiet. Then one day they'd be gone, and Miss Eleanor would tell us they'd been sold somewhere far away where the work was easier. Sarah's account included disturbing details about changes she observed in those selected for Eleanor's special duties. She described one man, Joseph, who had been moved to the basement in June 1851. After 2 weeks, his hands started shaking so bad he couldn't hold a spoon. When I asked if he was sick, he just stared at nothing and said, "She puts the wires on different parts every day and writes down what happens." He wouldn't say more, just kept rubbing his wrists where I could see marks like burns. Sarah's testimony was largely dismissed at the time, the word of a servant against that of a plantation mistress, despite the physical evidence discovered after the fire. But her account aligned with certain physical findings, particularly the modifications made to the basement room that had served as Eleanor's indoor laboratory. Architectural analysis of the remaining structure, conducted in 1963, revealed that the basement had been renovated to include drainage channels cut into the stone floor, all leading to a pipe that emptied into the bayou. The walls had been lined with sheet metal in certain sections, an expensive modification that served no obvious domestic purpose. Metal rings were found bolted to the stone at intervals approximately at the height of a person's wrists and ankles when standing against the wall. The most significant testimony came from Samuel Taylor, a carpenter from Franklin, who had been hired to build what Eleanor described as storage cabinets for the basement in 1847. His sworn statement given to the authorities after the fire described constructions that bore little resemblance to ordinary storage. She had me build these compartments, you see, like narrow wardrobes, but with small holes drilled in the doors and these complicated pipe fittings running to and from each one. When I asked what they were for, she said it was for a new method of preserving botanical specimens using vapor circulation. Paid me double my usual rate to complete the work and not discuss it in town. Taylor's testimony continued with a detail he had initially withheld. The last time I was at Willow Creek, delivering the final cabinet, I heard a sound coming from one of the completed units, a tapping, like someone trying to communicate. When I mentioned it, Mrs. Blackwood said it was just the expansion of the wood in the humid air. But wood don't tap in a pattern, sir, and it don't stop suddenly when someone tells it to be quiet. After Thomas's death, Eleanor withdrew further from parish society. The few visitors received at Willow Creek in the late 1840s described her as preoccupied and speaking with unusual animation only when discussion turned to scientific matters. Dr. E. Nathaniel Pierce, a physician with academic connections to Philadelphia who visited the plantation in 1848, wrote in his private journal that Eleanor had shown him certain experimental preparations that left him deeply concerned. Mrs. Blackwood appears to have developed techniques for tissue preservation that exceed any I have witnessed in medical schools, he wrote. When I inquired as to how she had perfected such methods, she was evasive, mentioning only ample opportunity for trial and error. More disturbing was her interest, in my opinion, regarding how long consciousness might persist in a brain deprived of normal bodily functions. I made my excuses and departed earlier than planned. Dr. Pierce elaborated further in a subsequent entry. She showed me a preparation that she claimed was a portion of neural tissue maintained in vitality for over a week outside its original organism. The specimen was contained in a glass vessel filled with a bluish solution connected to a galvanic apparatus that delivered rhythmic electrical pulses. I would have dismissed her claims entirely had I not observed with my own eyes the tissue's response to stimuli, contractions and expansions corresponding to adjustments in the electrical current. When I expressed amazement at this achievement, Mrs. Blackwood replied with unsettling calm, "This is merely the beginning. I am working toward the preservation of higher functions, sensation, perception, perhaps even cognition. I find myself troubled not only by the implications of such work, but by the question of how she has obtained appropriate specimens for her experiments." Dr. Pierce's journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1886, also contained a sealed letter addressed to the Louisiana authorities, to be delivered only in the event of his unexpected demise. The letter, opened by his executor but never delivered as intended, contained allegations regarding Eleanor's research that were considered too fantastical to be credible. The letter was filed away and forgotten until Professor Harrington discovered it during his research in 1959. "I have reason to believe," Dr. Pierce wrote, "that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood of Willow Creek Plantation is engaged in research of the most unethical nature, involving human subjects who have not given consent." During my visit, I observed equipment suitable only for surgical procedures, quantities of preservative solutions far exceeding any legitimate research need, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be human tissue maintained in an unnatural state through chemical and electrical means. I fear that individuals may have been harmed in the course of these experiments, and I provide this statement as testimony should any investigation become necessary. The spring of 1851 brought unusually heavy rains to St. Mary Parish. The bayou swelled beyond its banks, and the road to Willow Creek became impassable for weeks at a time. This isolation suited Eleanor's purposes. According to later testimony, it was during this period that she intensified what she called her important work. The local newspaper, the Franklin Planter's Banner, noted the extreme weather conditions. The road to Willow Creek and points east has become a river unto itself. Messengers report that the Blackwood plantation stands as an island in a sea of floodwater, with boats the only means of approach. Mrs. E. Blackwood has declined offers of evacuation, stating that she and her household are well supplied and in no danger. This isolation meant that for nearly 6 weeks, no outsiders visited Willow Creek. No deliveries were made, no messages were sent. When the waters finally receded in late April, Eleanor resumed her regular orders from Franklin merchants, but with notable additions: larger quantities of ice, specialized chemicals, and unusually several volumes on electrical theory from a bookseller in New Orleans. The first documented disappearance occurred in March, when Mary, described in household records as approximately 24 years of age and good health, was selected for special duties in the main house. Sarah testified that Mary had initially seemed pleased with the assignment, which came with better food and reduced labor. After 2 weeks working closely with Eleanor, however, Mary's demeanor changed dramatically. She wouldn't talk about what happened in that room, Sarah recalled, but she stopped eating almost entirely. She'd sit staring at nothing, and sometimes I'd find her crying without making a sound. When I asked what was wrong, she just said, "She's finding out how to keep things alive that shouldn't be." The next day, Miss Eleanor told us Mary had been sold to a family in Mississippi. Sarah also revealed that Mary had shown her strange marks on her arms, little circular burns, all in a row, like someone had pressed hot metal against her skin. Mary had been reluctant to explain these injuries, saying only that Miss Eleanor needs to know what different parts do when this electricity comes. Throughout the summer months, 3 more servants disappeared in similar fashion: Joseph in June, Harriet in July, and William in August. Each followed the same pattern: selection, a period of assistance in Eleanor's laboratory, behavioral changes noted by other servants, and then sudden sale to distant plantations with paperwork that later proved impossible to verify. A particularly disturbing account came from Robert, a stable hand who claimed to have overheard a conversation between Eleanor and Joseph shortly before his disappearance. Joseph was begging her, Robert testified, "Please, mistress, don't separate me like the others." And she just laughed, saying something about how separation was precisely the point of the experiment, that his contribution would advance understanding of neural independence. I didn't understand what they were talking about, but Joseph came out of that room looking like he'd seen his own grave dug. Eleanor's scientific correspondence during this period, preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Academy of Medicine under the name T. Blackwood, reveals her growing excitement about breakthroughs in what she termed vital preservation. In a letter dated July 1851, she wrote, "I have succeeded where Galvani and his followers could only theorize. The application of specific electrical currents and chemical baths has allowed me to maintain tissue viability far beyond normal biological constraints. More remarkably, I have documented evidence of sensory response in specimens separated from their original physiological systems." A subsequent letter elaborated on her methods. The key breakthrough came with the development of a nutrient solution that, when circulated through the specimen and combined with precisely timed electrical stimulation, prevents cellular degradation almost indefinitely. I have now maintained viable neural tissue for 23 days, with continued response to stimuli throughout this period. The implications for our understanding of consciousness itself are profound. If sensation persists in isolated neural structures, then where precisely does the seat of individual identity reside? Is awareness divisible? Can consciousness be preserved in fragments? These are the questions my current series of experiments seeks to answer. The Philadelphia Academy responded with polite skepticism, requesting more detailed experimental protocols or a demonstration. Eleanor never replied to this request. Instead, her subsequent correspondence shifted to a medical researcher in Boston who showed greater interest in her claims. The Boston connection would later prove significant, as shipping records discovered by Professor Harrington showed multiple deliveries from Willow Creek to a private address in Boston throughout the fall of 1851, deliveries listed simply as research materials and transported in specially constructed containers packed with ice. The researcher, Dr. Howard Phillips, was known in Boston medical circles as brilliant but controversial. His published work focused on nervous system regeneration, and he had been censured once by the Massachusetts Medical Society for unspecified ethical violations in his research methodology. Phillips's correspondence with Eleanor, preserved in his personal archive, shows an evolution from professional curiosity to disturbed fascination. Your results, if verifiable, represent an unprecedented advance in our understanding of neural viability, he wrote in September 1851. I am particularly intrigued by your suggestion that conscious response might be maintained in isolated sensory organs. If you would consent to share your preservation formula, I have facilities here that could extend your research considerably. By October, their correspondence had grown more specific, with Eleanor providing detailed instructions for the handling of the specimens she shipped to Boston. The containers must remain sealed until ready for examination, she wrote. The solution is sensitive to light and air exposure. When you connect the electrical apparatus, begin with the lowest setting. You will observe initial response at this level. Increase gradually while noting any changes in reaction patterns. Please record with particular care any responses that suggest retained memory or recognition, as this would confirm my theory regarding the persistence of consciousness beyond bodily integrity. As September turned to October, the atmosphere at Willow Creek grew increasingly tense. Parish records note 2 servants escaped the plantation during this period, but were captured and returned. Unusually, Eleanor did not have them punished, as would have been customary. Instead, according to Sarah's testimony, she merely looked at them with that cold, calculating expression and said they would serve a different purpose now. Both were immediately relocated to the basement rooms. Neither was seen again. During this period, Eleanor's household expenses show significant outlays for specialized equipment delivered from New Orleans, glass vessels of unusual design, additional electrical components, and larger quantities of chemical preservatives. The plantation's agricultural production continued to decline, with fields left untended as Eleanor focused increasingly on her research. Local merchants began to note strange details in their dealings with Willow Creek. The ice dealer, James Cooper, mentioned to the sheriff after the fire that he had been delivering unprecedented quantities to the plantation throughout the fall. 500 pounds a week, regular as clockwork, he testified. When I asked what they needed so much ice for, especially as the weather cooled, the house servant just looked scared and said, Miss Eleanor needed it for her preparations. Never seen so much ice go to one household in all my years in business. By November, unusual odors from the main house had become noticeable enough that Eleanor dismissed the remaining house servants from indoor duties, claiming that she was conducting agricultural experiments with fertilizers. She began keeping the house locked at all times, venturing out only to issue instructions or to supervise the delivery of large quantities of ice from Franklin, a considerable expense noted in her financial ledgers. Sarah's testimony included a disturbing observation from this period. Sometimes at night, we'd hear sounds coming from the main house, not like any sounds that should be there, like moaning, but not quite human. And once, passing by a basement window, I heard Miss Eleanor talking to someone saying, "The response is still present in the left hemisphere, but diminished in the right." But when I delivered her meal later, there was nobody else in the house that I could see. The turning point came on December 3, 1851, when Eleanor received a visitor. the only one in months. Records from the Franklin Hotel show that Dr. Howard Phillips of Boston had arrived 2 days earlier, renting a private room and hiring a local guide to take him to Willow Creek Plantation. No account of their meeting exists from either participant. What is known comes only from Sarah, who observed Dr. Phillips's departure late that evening. He came out of the house moving fast, like something was chasing him, she testified. His face was white as cotton, and he was retching over the side of his horse. Before he rode off, he looked back at the house and shouted something that sounded like, "You've damned yourself with this work." Miss Eleanor just stood on the porch, watching him go with that same still face she always had. The hotel register shows that Phillips checked out immediately, leaving behind personal belongings in his haste to depart. The stagecoach operator reported that the doctor had paid double fare for immediate passage to New Orleans, from where he boarded the first available ship to Boston. Dr. Phillips returned to Boston immediately. Inquiries by Professor Harrington in 1959 revealed that upon his return, Phillips had abandoned his medical practice, sold his properties, and relocated to Europe, apparently cutting all ties with his former colleagues. No record of his subsequent life or career has been found. However, before his departure from the United States, Phillips sent a letter to the Boston Medical Society that was sealed and marked "to be opened only in the event of my death." The letter was discovered during an archive reorganization in 1912 and opened as Phillips had been presumed dead for decades. Its contents were considered so disturbing that the Society's board voted to destroy it, but not before the secretary made a private copy, which eventually reached Professor Harrington. "What I witnessed at Willow Creek defies all natural law and human decency," Phillips wrote. "Eleanor Blackwood has developed methods of tissue preservation that go far beyond anything in legitimate medicine, but at a moral cost that cannot be calculated. I observed conscious response in separated bodily components, not merely the twitching of a frog's leg, as in Galvani's demonstrations, but sustained, deliberate reactions suggesting ongoing awareness. Most horrifying was her demonstration of what she termed persistent identity, preserved human brain tissue that, when electrically stimulated, produced recognizable patterns of response to specific questions. The implications are too terrible to contemplate. I believe her subjects have not willingly participated in these experiments, and I fear that in my scientific curiosity, I have become complicit in unspeakable acts." The fire that ultimately exposed Eleanor Blackwood's activities began in the early hours of December 12, 1851. The blaze was first noticed by servants awakened by what Sarah described as a terrible screeching sound, like metal being torn apart, coming from the main house. By the time they had dressed and emerged from their quarters, the east wing was fully engulfed, with flames visible through the windows of Eleanor's laboratory. Robert, the stable hand, provided additional details. Before the fire, there was another sound, like glass breaking, lots of it all at once. Then came that awful screaming that didn't sound human. Then the fire just seemed to explode out of the east wing, like something inside had burst. The flames were blue at first, which ain't natural for any fire I ever saw. The nearest fire brigade was in Franklin, too distant to provide timely assistance. The servants formed a bucket line from the well, but their efforts made little impact on the rapidly spreading fire. Curiously, according to multiple testimonies, Eleanor made no appearance during the fire, nor did she direct the firefighting efforts as would be expected of the property owner. "We expected her to come running out," Sarah testified, "but there was no sign of her. Some wanted to go in and search, but the flames were too fierce. By the time the roof collapsed, we assumed she must have perished inside." By dawn, the main structure had been largely destroyed. As the smoke cleared, Sheriff James Montgomery and 3 deputies arrived from Franklin, having been alerted by a servant sent to town for assistance. What they discovered in the ruins defied easy explanation. The basement laboratory, partially protected by its stone construction, remained somewhat intact. The official report described specialized equipment of medical nature, including an electrical apparatus connected to a system of chemical baths. The drainage channels in the floor contained residues that the local pharmacist, consulted by the sheriff, identified as consistent with preservative chemicals used in medical schools for anatomical specimens. Most disturbing were the modified storage cabinets described by carpenter Samuel Taylor. 3 remained partially intact. One contained what the report described only as human remains in an unnatural state of preservation. Later testimony from Deputy William Hargrove to the parish judge, given behind closed doors, allegedly detailed evidence that Eleanor had been experimenting with the preservation of living tissue, including attempts to maintain vital functions in body parts separated from their hosts. The cabinet contained a glass vessel, Hargrove reportedly testified, filled with a cloudy blue liquid. Floating in this liquid was what appeared to be a human hand, severed at the wrist. The hand was connected by copper wires to a small electrical device. When we accidentally disturbed the apparatus, the fingers of the hand moved, not in the random way of normal decay, but in a deliberate grasping motion, as if trying to seize something. I have been in law enforcement for 17 years and served in the Mexican War, but I have never witnessed anything that disturbed me so profoundly. Other cabinets contained similar arrangements, preserved human organs connected to electrical devices and immersed in chemical solutions. According to sealed court records partially destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1917 but reconstructed by Professor Harrington from witness depositions, these specimens showed evidence of recent activity. One document described a glass container holding what appeared to be a human eye, still moist and apparently undecayed despite separation from its body. Most disturbing was the observation that the pupil contracted when a lantern was brought near, suggesting some form of continuing function. The subsequent search for Eleanor Blackwood lasted weeks but proved fruitless. She had vanished as completely as the servants who had transferred ownership throughout that fateful year. The last confirmed sighting had been the previous evening, when Sarah had delivered a meal to the main house. Eleanor had been working in her laboratory, surrounded by notebooks and strange glass containers that Sarah was instructed not to look at directly. She seemed more excited than I'd ever seen her, Sarah recalled. She kept saying that she was on the verge of the final breakthrough, and that separation would no longer be a limitation. I didn't understand what she meant, but something in her voice frightened me more than usual. The financial trail offered few clues. Eleanor had liquidated most of the plantation's negotiable assets in the months preceding the fire, but no large withdrawals were recorded at banks in neighboring parishes. The only lead came from a ship's manifest discovered by investigators, showing that a woman matching Eleanor's description had booked passage to France from New Orleans on December 15, 1851, a journey she never completed, as the passenger failed to board. A curious detail emerged during the investigation. Eleanor's personal effects, recovered from her bedroom, which had been spared the worst of the fire, included a small leather case containing surgical instruments of exceptional quality. The case bore the initials E.M. rather than E.B., her maiden rather than married name, and appeared well used. A professional surgeon consulted by the sheriff remarked that the instruments showed signs of frequent use and recent cleaning. The wear patterns suggest precision work on soft tissue, consistent with advanced surgical procedures rather than simple dissection or medical treatment. The remains discovered in the laboratory were buried in unmarked graves in the Franklin Cemetery by order of the parish judge, who decreed that the entire matter should be consigned to silence for the good of public morals. Eleanor Blackwood was declared dead in absentia in 1858, and the ruined plantation was eventually sold to cover outstanding debts. "These are not the tools of an amateur or dilettante," he reported. "They have been used regularly and with skill." For decades, the story of Willow Creek faded into local legend, a tale of a widow driven mad by grief, embellished but essentially forgotten by all but the oldest parish families. Only with Professor Harrington's research in the late 1950s did a more disturbing possibility emerge. The woman, known professionally as Madame E., had published several anonymous papers on electrical stimulation of neurological tissue and chemical preservation techniques that allowed for the extended maintenance of cellular viability post-mortem. These papers caused a scandal in European medical circles, particularly when rumors began circulating that the research was not conducted on traditional cadavers, but on specially prepared specimens that retained some form of neural activity. While examining Boston Medical Society records, Harrington discovered references to a European woman operating a private anatomical laboratory in Paris during the 1860s. The French authorities investigated the laboratory in 1868 but found it abandoned, with equipment and records removed prior to their arrival. One medical journal from 1865, preserved in the archives of the Paris Faculty of Medicine, contained a review of Madame E's work by a prominent French anatomist. The preservation techniques described are revolutionary, if ethically questionable. Most remarkable is the claim that sensory function can be maintained in isolated organs through a combination of chemical baths and electrical stimulation. The author suggests that consciousness itself might be preserved in this manner, raising philosophical questions about the nature of human identity and the traditional boundaries between life and death. While scientifically fascinating, one must question the methods by which such observations were obtained. The final confirmed reference to Madame E comes from the diary of a Swiss physician who claimed to have visited her new laboratory in Vienna in 1871. He described an elderly but still lucid woman who showed him preparations that included what he called isolated sensory organs maintained in an apparent state of function through an elaborate system of electrical and chemical support. The physician noted with discomfort that one such preparation, a preserved human ear, seemed to react to sounds in the room, the associated preservation fluid displaying minute vibrations corresponding to spoken words. The physician's last entry regarding the meeting states only, "When I inquired as to the source of her specimens, Madame E smiled in a manner I can only describe as predatory, and said, they were people who served a higher purpose than they could have imagined. Their names are irrelevant now. I made my excuses and left, feeling I had been in the presence of something profoundly wrong." The physician also noted physical details that strengthened the connection to Eleanor Blackwood. Despite her advanced age, Madame E retains the bearing of aristocratic Southern American ancestry. Her accent, though she attempts to disguise it with French inflections, occasionally reveals its Carolinian origins. Most striking is the unusual ring she wears, a silver band set with a green stone, carved with what appears to be a family crest or coat of arms. She mentioned that it had belonged to her father, a medical man whose work she had extended beyond his limited imagination. No further historical trace of Eleanor Blackwood, if indeed Madame E was the same woman, exists in any records Professor Harrington could discover. His monograph, completed in 1963 but published only in a heavily edited form due to university concerns, concluded with a disturbing speculation. The techniques pioneered by E. Blackwood, while ethically abhorrent, may have advanced understanding of neural preservation in ways that influenced legitimate medical research for decades afterward. The question remains whether knowledge obtained through such means can ever be truly separated from its horrific origins. The scientific methods Eleanor developed, the preservation of neural tissue through specialized chemical solutions, the maintenance of cellular function through precisely calibrated electrical stimulation, bear disturbing similarity to techniques that would later become standard in legitimate neurological research. Whether her work directly influenced these developments or represents a parallel discovery remains unclear, but the possibility that modern medical knowledge may partially derive from her unethical experiments presents a troubling ethical quandary. The ruins of Willow Creek Plantation have long since been reclaimed by the Bayou. Local residents still avoid the area, claiming that on particularly still nights, sounds can be heard from the old foundation. Sounds like glass clinking against glass, and occasionally what might be voices, speaking words that make no sense to living ears. My grandfather would never go near that place, stated Franklin resident Thomas Wilson in an interview with Professor Harrington in 1960. He said when he was a boy, shortly after the Civil War, some local men tried to salvage building materials from the ruins. They fled after discovering a sealed room beneath the collapsed east wing, a room containing shelves of glass jars that they initially thought held preserved fruits or vegetables. It was only when they held their lanterns closer that they realized the contents were something else, something that shouldn't have been preserved. The men filled in the entrance with rubble and never returned. My grandfather would never specify exactly what they saw, but he would cross himself whenever the Blackwood place was mentioned. In 1965, a graduate student conducting environmental research near the old plantation site discovered a metal box buried beneath the remains of the greenhouse. The box, sealed with wax and remarkably well preserved, contained a leather-bound journal and several glass vials of unidentified substances. Before authorities could be notified, the student's campsite was found abandoned, with no sign of the researcher or the materials. The incident was attributed to misadventure in the treacherous Bayou environment, and the search was eventually abandoned. A colleague of the missing student later reported receiving a strange letter postmarked from Mexico City, but with no return address. The letter contained only a single page, apparently torn from a journal, with a hastily scrawled note. "What I found must be destroyed. Her work continues." The specimens still respond after all these years. The journal page itself contained what appeared to be scientific notations in a precise feminine hand, describing a method for neural suspension and the separation of consciousness from physical decay. Chemical formulas filled the margins, along with small anatomical sketches showing an unorthodox approach to nerve preservation. Perhaps it is best that some knowledge remains buried, some questions unanswered. The Bayou keeps its secrets, and the story of Eleanor Blackwood, what she discovered, what she created in her isolated laboratory, remains incomplete. But in fragments of records and whispered stories passed down through generations of St. Mary Parish families, there persists a warning about the dangers of knowledge pursued without moral constraint, of scientific curiosity divorced from human compassion. For those with ears to hear, the lesson of Willow Creek Plantation echoes still. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. In the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge, a single page of Eleanor Blackwood's scientific notes survived the judicial order to destroy all evidence from the case. Discovered misfiled among unrelated plantation records in 1962, the page contains a passage that perhaps best encapsulates the horror of what transpired at Willow Creek. The separation of consciousness from the whole has been the greatest challenge. My earlier subjects retained awareness for only minutes when isolated. Today's preparation survived for 6 hours, responding consistently to stimuli. The eyes, removed but maintained in the solution, continued to track movement. When presented with written questions, the preparatory baths allowed sufficient nerve connection for the fingers to form responses, though the handwriting deteriorated as cellular degradation progressed. Most significantly, when asked if it was in pain, the hand wrote always repeatedly until motion ceased. Tomorrow I will attempt a more complete preservation of the nervous system, which should extend response time considerably. The document was quietly resealed and restricted from public access by order of the state archivist. A footnote in Professor Harrington's unpublished manuscript suggests an even more disturbing possibility. The investigation following the Willow Creek fire focused primarily on the basement laboratory, but several witnesses mentioned modifications to other areas of the house that were never fully explored before the structure collapsed entirely. Sarah's testimony included reference to a locked room on the 3rd floor, where Eleanor sometimes worked late into the night. Given the extent of Eleanor's experimentation with preserving neural function, one must consider whether her ultimate goal might have been not just the maintenance of isolated tissues, but a more comprehensive preservation, perhaps even the transfer of consciousness itself. If so, the fire may have been not a conclusion, but merely an interruption of work that she later continued elsewhere. Some historical footnotes are better left unread, some scientific advances better left undiscovered. The boundary between life and death is not meant to be a permeable membrane, and those who attempt to traverse it may find that what returns is neither truly alive nor properly dead, but something that exists in a state of perpetual silent suffering. The widow of Louisiana's Bayou left no known descendants. The knowledge she sought has been officially lost to history. But in certain specialized medical archives, in private collections of forbidden scientific texts, references occasionally appear to preservation techniques of unusual efficacy, developed by an unnamed female researcher in the mid-19th century. And sometimes, rarely, in the most advanced research facilities, a scientist working late might pause, feeling a momentary chill, as if someone were looking over their shoulder, someone with cold, calculating eyes and hands that smell faintly of chemicals, designed to keep dead tissue from acknowledging its own demise. In 1972, during renovations to an old medical building in Vienna, workers discovered a sealed room containing laboratory equipment dating to the late 19th century. According to local newspaper accounts, the room contained specialized glass containers connected to an antiquated electrical system that appeared designed to circulate fluids while providing regular electrical impulses to whatever the containers had once held. The containers themselves were empty, but residue analysis reportedly showed traces of organic material and preservative chemicals similar to those described in Eleanor's notes. Most intriguing was a leather-bound journal found in a desk drawer, written in English but with sections in code. The journal was confiscated by university authorities and has never been made public, but rumors persist that it contained experimental notes, signed only with the initial E, detailing methods for consciousness preservation and neural transfer that went far beyond the medical understanding of that era, or indeed our own. Some say knowledge itself is neutral, that only its application can be judged good or evil. The story of Eleanor Blackwood suggests otherwise, that certain inquiries are themselves corrupted from inception, certain doors meant to remain forever closed. The humid air of Louisiana's Bayou country holds many secrets. This has been but one of them, a tale of ambition unchecked, of servants who disappeared into the silence of a widow's laboratory, and of experiments that challenge the very boundary between life and death. If you find yourself near Franklin, in St. Mary Parish, and are tempted to seek out the old Willow Creek plantation site, reconsider. The foundation stones remain, half submerged in the encroaching swamp, but locals will tell you nothing grows properly there, even now. Not even the Spanish moss that drapes every other tree in the bayou will touch those ancient stones. Some places remember what was done there, some earth refuses to forget, and in the deepest parts of the night, when the air lies heavy and still over the water, there are those who claim to hear sounds carrying from that forgotten place. The clink of glass, the hum of electricity, and something else. Something like distant, muffled screams that never quite stop, as if suspended in that terrible moment between life and oblivion that Eleanor Blackwood spent her life attempting to chart and control. Listen closely enough, and perhaps you too will hear them, the voices of those who served a purpose they never could have imagined, whose names have been lost, but whose suffering continues to echo across time, trapped in that unnatural twilight between existence and release. A final note from Professor Harrington's research, discovered after his death in 1967, but never published, suggests that his investigation extended beyond historical documents to first-hand exploration. A journal entry dated April 1962 reads, "Visited the Willow Creek site today. Local guide refused to accompany me past the old property line. The foundation remains largely as described in the sheriff's report, though now overgrown and partially submerged. Most interesting was the discovery of glass fragments near what would have been the east wing, thick, specialized glass, unlike common window panes, consistent with laboratory equipment of the period. While examining these fragments, I experienced a peculiar sensation, a pressure in my ears, as if someone were speaking just below the threshold of hearing. The words were indistinct, but the impression of urgency was unmistakable. I collected samples for analysis, but found upon returning to my vehicle that the glass fragments had crumbled to powder in my specimen bags. Some things, perhaps, resist being removed from their resting place. Sleep well, knowing that the widow of Louisiana's Bayou is long gone. Or is she? For what is death to one who spent her life denying its finality? What is an ending to one who saw human consciousness as something to be preserved, parceled, and sustained beyond its natural term? Perhaps somewhere, in some form we dare not contemplate, Eleanor Blackwood's work continues, her cold eyes still observing, her meticulous hand still recording results, her relentless mind still pushing forward into territory where science loses its claim to virtue and becomes something else entirely. Something that, like the deepest parts of the Bayou, should remain undisturbed and unexamined. For our own sake, let us hope that some secrets stay buried in the mud.